Welcome back. Well, Australians are still at war in Afghanistan. We're witnessing a dramatic shift in foreign policy by the United States towards the Asia region, particularly targeted at China. And of course, Australia is at the crossroads of the historic rise of China on the world stage. And of course, we have now assumed the presidency of the United Nations Security Council. The world is no longer a distant place. From the economy to our security, our future will largely be defined by what happens off our shores. So why are we not hearing more about it during the election campaign? With only days to go, of course, Syria has only recently just emerged as an issue of some significance. Let's bring in Professor Mark Beeson now from Murdoch University. Professor, nice to have you on the program. Is it a lack of interest from the public or a lack of courage or foresight from politicians that we don't see these issues debated more fully during our election campaign?
I think it depends on the issue to some extent. I think famously there are no votes in foreign policy in most elections, I think, and it's very difficult to think of issues that have really been a game changer since perhaps the Vietnam War might have been the last big issue that really influenced people's voting patterns in the foreign policy sense. So I think there's a general point to be made about that. But there's also the question about the amount of uniformity of opinion that exists on particular sorts of issues. And I think there are a number of issues that simply haven't been raised. The current engagement in Afghanistan being a case in point, for example, the relationship with the United States. All of these issues may have really compelling reasons for taking them seriously and for in favour of them and justifying Australia's involvement in them. But it's striking that they've had remarkably little public discussion or consideration given their importance.
Professor, one of the things that you've written about is that we no longer live in a Cold War era where our foreign policy decisions were much more clear-cut. And you've mentioned the US relationship. How long can we continue to remain broadly in lockstep with the United States, following them into war, being so closely aligned, when our interests, particularly in the region, may be at odds sometimes with the US?
Well, a lot of people have drawn attention to the fact that there's a disjuncture between our principal strategic relationship with the United States and the rise of China, which has rapidly become our most important trading partner. So clearly there's an underlying tension there, and there's a question about how any government would respond to those potentially disparate forces. And in Australia's case, it's quite striking that there's been great reluctance to deviate from a very long established bipartisanly supported position of very close allegiance strategically to the United States, and there's very little sign of that particular position changing anytime soon. Now, there may be good reasons for being in a close strategic alliance with the United States at different moments in history. Whether they're quite as compelling as they once were, because clearly nobody is threatening to invade Australia. The Chinese are certainly not planning to invade Australia with or without Collins-class submarines or any other piece of very expensive military hardware we might consider buying. So there's a different strategic environment in the world these days, and it's worth at least having a debate or a discussion about what the kind of dynamics and drivers of strategic policy or indeed economic policy, which arguably ought to be where our real focus lies these days, what the balance is between those kind of competing objectives that face Australia today.
Can we let go of that relationship, though, at a time when we're unsure ultimately about the motives of China and the implications of China's rise? Certainly it is in increasing its military capacity and showing more aggression to long-standing allies in the region like Japan. What are the concerns that you have about the choices and challenges that the rise of China may pose to Australia?
Well, one point to make about the general strategic environment in the region, I think, is that Australia can't make any real difference to any outcome of any possible conflict in the region because we're simply not a significant enough military player to make any difference. Our primary role and significance in conflicts, possible future conflicts, and certainly in past conflicts, has been in giving support and to a degree of legitimation to American foreign policy, essentially. So I think our strategic role there is not that significant. So it does raise the question of what Australia's real long-term national interests might be, and it's not inevitable that they would coincide with the United States or China's or anybody else's for that matter. It's not impossible to conceive the idea that Australia might actually have independent interests and independent positions of its own. And it's possible to argue, I think, that in many ways Australia actually has more in common with other countries of the region, so-called middle powers of the region that aren't superpowers of the sort that China or the United States might be seen to be, but have a different set of capabilities, have a different set of potential foreign policy priorities that are quite separate and distinct from those of the United States. And this is not an anti-American position, arguably. It's just simply a recognition of the fact that Australia might have very different and distinctive interests that reflect its particular position in the world and its particular security challenges in the world.
Professor, accepting that we haven't heard a lot of discussion about this during the election campaign, what are the consequences and the implications of Australia assuming the presidency of the UN Security Council as part of our rotating position there now? What are those consequences going to be for whoever forms government after September 7?
Well, I mean, Australia could potentially do something interesting and possibly even slightly important in terms of shifting debates on major issues in international affairs at the moment. My suspicion is they probably won't. Because of the close alignment with the United States, because of long-term support of the position of Israel, for example, I find it difficult to imagine that Australia will take any dramatic new position on many of the big issues that are currently facing the world today. I mean, I noticed in your report earlier in the bulletin, you had a clip from Tony Abbott, who's very likely to become the Prime Minister in a few days' time, saying that the Liberal Party, and he in particular, have what he described as a disposition to support the United States. And I think that's a pretty accurate description of the way that both sides of politics have generally thought about the relationship with the United States and the particular role that a country like Australia could and possibly should play in the world. But I think it's possible to conceive of Australia, or a country like Australia, playing quite a different kind of role in the world, and one that reflects the particular circumstances that confront a middle power rather than a superpower. And it's possible to imagine Australia putting different kinds of issues on the international agenda. I mean, I noticed that Australia's nominated the control of small arms as being one of the things they're particularly concerned about. And there may be some value in taking that kind of issue seriously, but I wouldn't have thought it was one of the key issues that confronts the so-called international community at the moment. So if this is going to be our big ticket agenda item when we take our seat on the United Nations, and it's not going to be a really huge or decisive issue, it seems to me.
Professor Beeson, a real pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.